uh, the granddaddy of yellow journalism, the man who helped to create the era of yellow journalism, Hearst, had no problem inventing evidence or fabricating proof of stories. Stories that would either sell more papers or advance his own economic and political agendas. No American newspaper publisher engaged in more true lies, fake news, than William Randolph Hearst, who at his peak in the early 1930s controlled a vast empire of 28 major newspapers, 18 magazines, several radio stations, and even a movie studio, Cosmopolitan Pictures. Now, in 1913, his massive web of newspapers, he already has a bunch of them by 1913, ran a photograph showing some Mexican children about to be shot. The photo was actually taken by a British tourist in Honduras who had simply asked some of the local kids to raise up their arms in order to make a better shot. In 1932, the Hearst papers showed a mob of unemployed storming Buckingham Palace. The picture was actually taken in 1929 as crowds waited anxiously for news about the king's illness. Hearst, well, he hated Joseph Stalin, Uncle Joe Stalin, and communist Russia so much that in 1935 he ran pictures showing a famine happening in Russia. This famine at the time did not exist. Meanwhile, some of his own editors at other newspapers that he owned inadvertently ran factually accurate stories about Soviet agricultural prosperity, ran these stories on the very same day. Now, while much of W.R. Hearst's fake news output was politically motivated, he was not above presenting sensationalistic fictional stories as fact. For example, a rather gothic tale about a woman-eating tree. Yes, he published a story as fact about a tree that had a taste for the ladies. I kid you not. Now, during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, which is essentially the warm-up for World War II, Hearst ran reports of the Loyalists committing atrocities, while these killings were actually committed by Franco's fascist rebels. Distorted reportage was the Hearst method of operation during the Spanish conflict, a conflict that also included the involvement of Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Uncle Joe Stalin. And the Hearst newspapers always sided with the Franco-fascists. But Hearst's most intense foray into world affairs happened in the late 1890s, and not only involved Spain, but also involved the island of Cuba. Hearst sent noted artist Frederick Remington to sketch atrocities committed during the early stages of war. There was an infamous exchange of telegrams between the pair, in which Remington tells Hearst, "There is no trouble here, and there will be no war." Hearst then tells Remington, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Now, Remington stayed in Cuba. His most infamous sketch was that of an American woman on a ship being strip searched by a slew of leering Cuban men. The Remington sketch provoked intense outrage all over the United States until Hearst's competitors at the New York World produced the woman in question. The woman claimed that she was indeed humiliated, but not by the Cubans, that she was humiliated by the Hearst newspapers. The woman had in fact been stripped and searched, but by matrons, and she was searched in a private room, and she was not searched by a slew of horny Cuban men. Now, undaunted, Hearst went on to champion other damsels in distress. His newspapers later deified a Cuban woman of dubious morals. She was a streetwalker. The Hearst newspapers turned her into a freedom fighter and revolutionary hero. Hearst carried the story of her daring escape from the Spanish, an escape managed by his own operatives. In reality, Hearst's operatives had used simple bribery to get her out of the clink, and his vast empire of newspapers and periodicals basically took every opportunity to fan public sentiment against Spain. Now, on February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine blows up in Havana Harbor, making armed conflict with Spain inevitable. The war that Hearst had promised Remington to furnish was now on the way, and the Hearst newspapers blamed the Spanish for the Maine's explosion. American outrage was not only fueled by Hearst. The public at large had fervent sympathy for the Cubans. The insurgents had been struggling for independence since 1895, and thousands of Cubans had died in Spanish concentration camps. So on April 21st, 1898, the Spanish-American War begins. It lasts less than 4 months. The Spanish-American War ends 4 centuries of Spanish domination in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and brings the United States increased respect in the community of world affairs, as well as a bounty of territories. The Spanish-American War is the beginnings of the United States world empire. The U.S. Navy, unlike Spain's, was honed to a fine edge. And in just a few hours, the maps of the world changed as Spain relinquished its last jewels of empire and the United States flexed its considerable military muscle. Exploration of the battleship Maine's hull, done in the 1990s, showed that the explosion was internal, most likely an explosion of the Maine's volatile gunpowder, and not a Spanish mine or torpedo. But then, even if William Randolph Hearst had known the truth, he would have printed the fake news story anyway, since it helped to serve his political aspirations. Hearst served in Congress. He was a congressman between the years 1903 and 1907, and Hearst made numerous unsuccessful runs for other offices, including senator and governor. He would continue his journalistic trickery, fake news, for almost another half century. Now, in the 1920s into the 1940s, Hearst builds a grandiose castle in San Simeon, California. He sleeps with movie star Marion Davies and holds court at his estate. Extravagance and the Great Depression weakened Hearst financially, and by 1940 he lost control of his empire. He spends his last years in seclusion until his death in 1951. Citizen Hearst had few, if any, regrets. Anything goes was his policy on the news. Bullshit or not, print it as long as it sells newspapers. All right. That's it.